of everybody's time. So let me begin by saying my name is Paul McCullough. I'm the executive director for First Amendment Voice. And first, I want to thank Patrick Murphy, the Honorable Patrick J. Murphy, and the Honorable Aaron C. Connaughton for joining us here this evening. I also want to thank everybody that is an attendee for our event here this evening. So we've called this a coffee talk, and familiar with First Amendment Voice. Our mission is to encourage civil discourse and active civic engagement. And we do that by focusing on just three core values: unity, healing, and compassion. So we believe that the country's become very polarized, very divided, and that might not be the best thing for our country. So instead of the idea of I'm right, you're wrong, and you're an idiot, we want to help people to learn how to come alongside each other. So at least understand each other's perspective and be able to have an understanding of where that person's coming from, understand their story, and understand, where that person is coming from. So when you reach that point, you can at least have a position of being respectful to one another, and then from there you can be able to engage in community. So we did a difficult conversations workshop a few weeks ago, and that was geared towards helping us have these types of conversations where you can engage in community together and have a healthy sense of civil discourse and civic engagement. I think it's important to understand the role that we play, or that the military community plays within that, and how we can engage in civic community without being hostile, without being exploited by politicians, and really understanding and utilizing what the First Amendment tells us our rights are as veterans and service members. So in order to help facilitate that discussion, I've asked two good friends of mine, the Honorable Patrick Murphy, who was the 32nd Undersecretary of the Army, and he was also the first Iraq War veteran elected to Congress, and also the Honorable Erin C. Connaughton. She was the 23rd Undersecretary of the Air Force, and she was also, after that, the 6th Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. And I've had the distinct privilege and honor of serving as Chief of Staff for both these individuals. So in just a couple minutes, they are going to give you a little bit of background about their story and why they think the First Amendment is important, as well as the importance of our organization. A couple of admin notes. So one, we are recording this session so we can use it for social media purposes, as well as just an hour. So I want to honor everybody's time with that. And then also I'd like to point out that if you have any questions, Janina Grigg from our team is on the line, and she will be receiving any questions that you might have. Please send them to her in the chat. And then towards the end of our session this evening, after Patrick and Aaron have gone through a lot of the talking points, we'll open it up to the questions that have come in through the chat, and I'll give those questions to Patrick and Aaron. So with that, Patrick, I'd like to pass it over to you for any opening remarks.
And to be with my former Pentagon colleague and House colleague, the House Armed Services Committee, Madam Secretary Erin Connaughton, one of my favorite Jersey girls in the world. So, so it's great to be all with you. Hey, when Dr. Paul asked me to join here tonight, it's very personal to me. I spent over 3 years of my life teaching constitutional law at West Point, the United States Military Academy at West Point. Every single cadet, all 4,000 cadets, actually take constitutional and military law. They're policies, foreign domestic, that they'll take that obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. And that Constitution, that blueprint of our country, that's where we have the checks and balances. That's where we have the separation of powers, the executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, where it shows that one is not more powerful than the other, and that's checks and balances. There's constitutional fundamental principles. But in those constitutional fundamental principles of equality, justice, freedom, liberty, in that you have incorporated the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution only was ratified and passed with the promise that the Bill of Rights would pass soon after. There was 10 amendments. There was actually 12 amendments first, but 10 got through. And those 10 amendments, probably the most important one is the First Amendment, which gives you 5 rights: the freedom of the press, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to petition your government against any redress. So again, that First Amendment is so incredibly important. And so it's an honor for me to be here. That First Amendment and that Constitution actually gives our service members more rights in some instances and less rights in other instances. More rights when it comes to the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, more rights when it comes to Sixth Amendment right to counsel, but frankly, less rights under the First Amendment, because if you're in the military, you can't say, "Hey, it's Sunday. I believe that this is the Lord's day, and I'm just going to sit in my barracks and hang out all day." That's not possible. We do try to make as much as possible religious accommodations, but you have less freedom of religion rights. You have less freedom of speech rights. You can't say, "Hey, I want to just tell the enemy where I am because I have the freedom of speech." So it's an amazing, basically push and pull with what rights our troops, our active troops, and our veterans get. The courts generally defer to good order and discipline of the military. The Supreme Court, through generations, has generally deferred to the military. And Congress plays such an important role, obviously. So I just wanted this to reiterate, I know, the topic was kind of alarming. Topics like, hey, the politicization of the military, and I put this out on my social media at Patrick Murphy, PA, and prep for this. The military is a apolitical organization. We don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, independent, non-affiliated voter. I was non-affiliated. I was independent my whole life. We hope you choose not to. We have things such as the Hatch Act, which forbids you from being overly active in political campaigns. Yes, you can vote in elections. Yes, you can have a bumper sticker on your car, but you cannot politicize that office that you represent, whether you're a captain or a first sergeant or whatever, because the president of the United States has given a special trust and confidence in all of our leaders in the military. And so, again, it is that, you're not taking an oath to a political party, you're not taking an oath to the president of the United States, you're actually taking an oath to support and defend that Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So, we could talk about, and we will talk about tonight, the military and the politicization of it, or the attempt to politicize it. I do think that the military has stayed apolitical, and that when they have stepped over the line, they've been very quick to apologize and right the course so things don't happen again. But our military is comprised of over 2 million individuals. They're humans. Sometimes they make mistakes, and there's regulations and rules in place so they never drift too far to the left or right when it comes to out of bounds politically. I didn't mean that political, meaning political party. I meant, what the left limit and right limits are. I will say that the outside forces that are trying to politicize the military, trying to call it a woke military, these are human beings that are not part of our institution. Civilians in our military. These are individuals that are trying to politicize the military when it is an apolitical organization. They have failed. They will continue to fail. And it's a shame at a time when the economy is really on an upswing, that it's less than 3% unemployment, which has been historic lows, which is a positive thing. But when you have historic lows, it's harder to recruit in the military. If the military was so politicized, our retention rates will not be so after year in the longest wars, many of them in the longest wars in American history, over 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've done 2 combat deployments. My brother's has done 2 combat deployments. And the fact is that, the folks who have served in combat uh, appreciate the military, are signing up to be retained by our military because they realize that it is an apolitical organization. It is an organization comprised of men and women, black and white, um, people who believe in God, people who don't believe in God, people who have strong opinions, people who just want to get the job done. But the fact is that we're all there to get the job done, to keep our families safe here at home, and to live by our values and our principles that the Constitution so eloquently provide to this. That the government is empowered by the people. It is not given by a king or a queen. It is given by we the people, and that's where the government gets its power from. And that's why we have the checks and balances. That's why we have things like federalism, the federal government versus state governments, but also, as I already mentioned, those Bill of Rights, which encapsulates the First Amendment of our Constitution, that freedom of speech, that First Amendment right, those five freedoms that I've already outlined and that we'll talk about here tonight. So I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Paul, but just very glad to be here and glad to talk about an issue that I'm so passionate about.
Thanks, Patrick. I knew that you were really passionate about the Constitution, and that's definitely why I wanted to have you here and really appreciate your opening remarks. Honorable Erin Condon, your thoughts, madam.
Thank you, Paul, and Secretary Murphy, Pat, to have your framing of the issue at the very top. I'll apologize to folks, as probably some of you experienced today. We had some intense storms come through. I'm currently without electricity, which is why the lighting is a little weird. I'm trying to get as much natural light as possible. Hopefully that maybe the electricity will come back mid-course here, but unlike Patrick and Paul, I am not a veteran myself, but I've worked around the House Armed Services Committee. Patrick was a newly elected member of Congress, and I, for my entire 10 years on the Hill, was a professional staff member for the House Armed Services Committee, and then later as staff director, the senior most staffer who kind of organizes everything to help get the National Defense Authorization Act, recently in the news, passed out of the House and through finally become law, signed by whichever president was in office, and that's a tradition that's continued since the late 1940s, that regardless of party controlling Congress, regardless of party controlling the presidency, there has been a bipartisan and collective effort to ensure that that major piece of legislation, which provides authorities and benefits to military service members and their families, continues to be passed on a year in, year out. Get enacted by Congress, because as Secretary Murphy alluded to, Congress's role here is very important. I also want to, congratulate Paul for not only his role in this organization, but for bringing a topic like this to the fore. While I agree with Patrick that I've seen very few in the 20 plus years I've worked with the military at all levels, I've seen very few cases of true politicization, but there are topics where the media can, for sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not, characterize the military as being politicized. And so I think this is a worthy topic. I have, since I left government, become very passionate about civics education for our young people. I come from a part of New Jersey that doesn't traditionally have a lot of military service. Young people choosing this profession either for a short period of time or for a lengthy period of time. And I don't think those two things are necessarily causal, but I do, in talking to young people, have a concern about how much basic civics education is happening these days. So, any dialogue like this with adults and parents, I think, can be extremely beneficial. A couple things where Patrick spent a lot of time educating young people at West Point about the importance of the Constitution and about what their rights and privileges would be in a political environment as they left the academy and took their oath of office. My educational experience as it regards these issues was often with members of Congress themselves. Over the 10 years that I served with the Armed Services Committee, I'm going to say we probably had at least 180 unique members of Congress who passed through our committee. It's a very large committee, and for very pure of heart reasons, particularly during election years, members of both political parties would be interested in doing events with service members of what I did, regardless of whether they were veterans themselves or not veterans, was to help members of Congress understand what the left and right kind of barriers were on political activity for members of Congress. And then when I became a senior political appointee myself in the Pentagon, we came up against the same issues. And so I got to live it kind of from both sides, both as the advisor to the person making the decision, and then ultimately as the decision maker myself. Two other things I wanted to mention just before we get the dialogue going. One is that the Hatch Act that Patrick mentioned, which, not only doesn't prevent the military from voting. If you all have served, you've probably been encouraged by your senior enlisted leader or your commanding officer that, it's your responsibility as a citizen of the United States to vote. And so voting is part and parcel of being a citizen of this country, regardless whether you're in uniform or not. The Hatch Act applies, and maybe I thought this was perhaps a little strange, not to me, but when I tried to explain it to my family. The Hatch Act, which limits political activity by DoD civilians, is most restrictive toward those of us who've been chosen by the president and confirmed by the Senate in terms of what we were allowed to do. But particularly serving at the Pentagon, I thought it made great sense because we were living by the same rules, if you will, that our uniformed partners were. And we can talk about that too. On the issue of woke policies, as Patrick mentioned, and these certainly got a lot of attention in this year's Defense Authorization Act. I would say that there is a distinction between policies that directly, where the intent is to politicize the military one way or the other, toward one set of policies or the other, and those policies that reflect a changing attitude within society. And we can get into perhaps where people think some things are or aren't. Patrick, I don't think I'm speaking out of school by saying he was one of the major uh, uh, leaders in the effort to and I would say for myself that that is a case, I think, where society's attitudes toward the policy changed over time rather than an effort by one party to uh, force its own agenda onto the military. But this is where things get into that challenging, difficult conversation space that Paul referenced at the beginning. But I think the more that we can talk it through and see where people's perspectives are, the better that we can do for our military and for our society generally. So, Paul, I'll pass it back to you at this point.
Aaron, thank you so much for those opening comments. And having worked with you for over a year, I knew that you had a very broad and deep range of experience through your time in Congress and working as a senior appointed official. So really appreciate your perspective in tonight's discussion as well.
Of course.
So the first question I wanted to ask both of you, and both of you have touched on it a little bit already, is what is your understanding of the parameters that service members and veterans have to adhere to when engaging in political activities, and why were they created?
Madam Secretary, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Well, I would say there is a distinction here between currently serving military and veterans. Once you're out of the service, you're free, obviously, to avail yourself of any avenue that is referenced not only in the First Amendment, but more generally, to be a fully engaged citizen of the country and to express in any way that you like, so long as you're out of uniform and not seeking to hold up that your perspective is one that you're expressing on behalf of the military as a whole, or the United States Army, or whatever the organization may be. For those of you who've served, obviously, you know that in taking your oath, whether enlisted or as an officer, you limiting some of your First Amendment rights, as Secretary Murphy mentioned earlier. So, like I said before, you always retain the right to vote. You can do certain types of activities, like be in an assembly if you are in civilian clothes, but you cannot come out and set up a website that says Connaughton, and I believe that all Democrats are evil, and you should, if you're a member of the military, only vote for the Republican Party. I'm being extreme here, but you can't be a leader of any political organization or, particularly in uniform, advocate anyone to take on your personal views on behalf of the U.S. military or otherwise. Patrick, let me know where I've gone astray there, or anything else that I may have missed.
Nope, I couldn't agree more. You're absolutely positively correct.
And Honorable Condon, the one thing that I wanted to add on to what you just said there, you mentioned that veterans have a pretty broad spectrum of what they are and are not allowed to do. And I say the one caveat to that, a number of people, myself included, are civilians with the veteran status, and I serve as our Army Reserve Ambassador. And I got multiple briefings saying, as a Reserve Ambassador, when you are acting in that capacity, and you are wearing that hat and doing those duties, you need to walk a very thin line and not say anything about any party. You have to be very apolitical. So if you have any beliefs, or you want to endorse somebody or anything at all like that, it cannot be while you are acting as a Reserve Ambassador on behalf of the Army and the Chief of Army Reserves.
It's a great point.
Okay, so to keep the conversation going, I wanted to ask both of you if you can describe a were exploited for political gain. Is there any time when you saw, things really go sideways in that capacity?
Patrick, do you want to start or you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, if it's okay,
Go
I mean,
ahead.
I think probably the most high profile case was when, during COVID, uh, there's some protests outside the White House in what's called Lafayette Square, and it happened quickly, but uh, the president at that time asked the chairman of the Judicial Staff and the Secretary of Defense and others to walk over there and frankly held court there while they pushed protesters, which were, again, as I talked about, the First Amendment gives 5 freedoms, including the some wash from the helicopter wash as well. But long story short, pushed him back, and an impromptu speech was given by the president because he was given more of a political speech about what the protesters are talking about. And there was the chairman of the Judicial chief of staff there, who was a 4-star general who was there next to him. It added the weight of the military endorsing him with the president of the United States. And within the next 48 hours, the chairman of the chief of staff felt so compelled that he went and gave a public apology at the National Defense University in front of troops, saying, "Hey, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have been there. There was political rhetoric and political speech given, and politics has no place in uniform. And I want to apologize to my brothers and sisters in our profession." When you make a mistake, I think it's actually morally courageous that you go up and let people know and you shine a light on your mistakes so other people can learn from it. And so it doesn't happen again, in future administrations. So I would say that's probably the most high profile public one. I won't bore you with the cases where, I had troops come in and can I put a George Bush bumper sticker in my car, or a John Kerry we have 2 million troops. They come in, and the answer was yes. You could put a bumper sticker in your car. You cannot put a bumper sticker in your front door of your office, in visible areas, because that would denote that your office is there. But yes, you could put a lawn sign on your property, your personal property, and you could put a bumper sticker on your car. But no, you can't wear a political button to work on uniform or be in uniform at a political rally.
Secretary Murphy, thank you for that. I met the chairman a couple of times, once of them with you, and I know that you just had an opportunity to interview him for your show, The Warrior Class, and I watched that segment where you had a deep conversation with him. He's a man that is very honorable, very humble, and very passionate about the Constitution, so it doesn't surprise me that he made a public apology for stepping a bit out of bounds. So thank you for sharing that. Honorable Condon, your thoughts?
Sure, I'll just add a couple things. I completely agree that is the most high profile and I think in the end well handled example, particularly by General Milley. But I'll also point out that the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, just happens to be a personal friend. But I would say this regardless. Former West Point officer, he did not have exactly the same restrictions on him as did the chairman, but also expressed that, so if anything, I guess what I'm pointing to here is a unity of effort and spirit that generally exists between the senior civilians and the senior uniformed officers in the Pentagon. I have not seen in my own personal experience any kind of direct politicization. I've had members of Congress comment to me about when we traveled to Iraq and Afghanistan. Generally, when we walked into commanders' offices, the television was tuned to Fox. and asked me if that was appropriate. And I said, yes. I mean, it it does not, whether, regardless of how you feel about it, it's not a proxy for a particular well, I won't, some might feel that it's a proxy for a political organization, but senior commanders need to get their news from back home as well. And, there's nothing to say that 20 minutes later, he wasn't, looking at MSNBC or CNN to get a different perspective. The only other thing I thought I'd throw out in this context, because it happens in the House, definitely happens every four. And this happened, in my experience, most expressly in the early, I'll say, for the first 5 to 7 years that we were in Afghanistan, and then 2 years later in Iraq, is the desire of members of Congress in difficult re-election districts to be able to take back home benefits that they particularly advocated for, so that they could demonstrate to that community or to the veterans community that they had done something specific. And so, at the beginning, there were big things: TRICARE for life for reservists and National Guard members, other major pieces of legislation. And then over time, what was left was providing more narrow benefits to particular groups of service members. And, one can debate the merits of any one of them, but, on both sides of the aisle, there was always a desire in an election year to be able to take something back home that directly benefited troops and families. And so, it was a fine line for the chairman and ranking member of the committee, as well as those of us who were their primary advisors, to try to ensure that that was balanced, as bipartisan as possible, and of benefit to the U.S. military, as opposed to just doing something for the sake of doing something.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So continuing on with this same thread here, something else that I think is relevant, Patrick had mentioned people having bumper stickers, maybe on your car, but not necessarily on your office door. And you talked about, whether or not you can have Fox News on, or CNN, or whatever it is. So how are service members, maybe unit commanders, allowed to exercise their First Amendment rights while staying within the regulation? What are the things that they are permitted to do that is within the confines of the Hatch Act?
Patrick, why don't you start, since you've been on both the uniformed and the civilian side of the House there?
Sure. I'll take the military side first, Paul, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you.
Listen, you're an American. You don't give all your rights just because you're in the military. So I mentioned, you have these freedoms, and even under the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, Second Amendment, you have these freedoms. They're not, they're not like all encompassing. Meaning, yes, like as an example, you have, as a civilian, you have a freedom of speech. Fighting words, incitement to riot, defamation of character, obscenity, right? So, Dr. Paul, you're a great looking guy, but if you decide to walk down and go streaking in the middle of the, New Jersey, there in Williamstown, New Jersey, that would be illegal. It'd be bad judgment. I know you wouldn't do that, right? Why? You could say, hey, I have a First Amendment right to walk naked. I'm an American. You have a First Amendment right. You can express yourself, but not if it's obscene, and that would be obscene, of course. So just like in the military, so you have rights to vote. We make great paints, so but actually attend a political event in your civilian clothes. You cannot be there with military uniforms on. So those are basically the parameters. You can give your personal money to candidates that you believe in. So as long as those candidates aren't advocating to overthrow the government of the United States of America. That would be arguably collusion, and you can't stand behind what their planks are. And again, I don't mean there's the two political parties, but the major political parties across America, that's what their planks are. So hopefully that gives you the left and right limits, basically. And on the civilian side, again, I'll defer to Aaron Connaughton, but very similar. You could almost to a T, if you want to go to a political event, it can't be at a work day, it can't be work sense. But Dr. Paul, I'll turn it back to you, and more importantly, Secretary Connaughton.
Honorable Connaughton, your thoughts, madam?
I don't have very much to add other than to Patrick's last point regarding civilians, which is again under the Hatch Act, particularly for senior civilians, either in the roles that he and I served in, or with senior executive service members of the department. While they can give money to candidates or to political action committees, they cannot lead one or host a fundraiser. So there's some distinctions, but I think the most important thing here is what he mentioned in terms of those serving in uniform.
And one other thing, just as a follow-up, wanted to ask both of you. I don't think you had mentioned it. My understanding is that if I am a service member, I am not authorized by the regulation, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, to say anything disparaging about the Commander-in-Chief. Regardless of what I might think about the President, he is the Commander-in-Chief, and I do not have the right to say anything at all disparaging about the Commander-in-Chief. I just need to follow orders and move out smartly. Is that accurate?
I believe that's accurate, Patrick.
Yes, under the Uniform Code of Military Judgment and Army or service regulations, yes.
Okay, so moving on to help keep us on time, and the last thing I wanted to ask both of you, what do you think that we, as members of First Amendment Voice and from a larger perspective, engaged citizens, can do to help people understand that really serving in the military is about being a patriotic American? It's not about being a Republican or a Democrat or any other party that we, are there to be politicized, and we just want to engage and serve our country.
I mean, just to start, Patrick, I would say doing events like this and doing them as broadly as possible, it's critical. And I think if, we can particularly, I don't know what the split is in terms of those of us, those joining the call between veterans and non-veterans. But I think it's important for, and this is something that I've, as Paul knows, that we've talked about for a while. I think it's really important that this conversation move beyond just military service members and veterans to include the broader American population, many of whom sadly have no exposure to the US military. They don't know people who are serving or have served, or if they did, it was somebody's grandfather back in Korea or World War II. So I just think this kind of dialogue is incredibly valuable beyond the military community.
Thank you, ma'am. Honorable Murphy.
Yeah, I would say just echo her words. I mean, I think it's incredibly important for all of us as Americans to realize that where we used to go and turn on the news and learn from people like Walter Cronkite, who would play straight and right down the middle of the political channel that they believe in. And it's not to learn about the news or learn about events or to think critically. It's really to, frankly, affirm their current political beliefs. So again, I'm a contributor for Fox News. I will be on Fox News on Thursday, 11:15. I'll be on Fox News next Wednesday, or I'm sorry, August 9th from 12 to 1 for the whole hour. The fact is that people go to Fox News if they have a certain political leaning. They'll go to MSNBC if they have another political leaning. Push back or to argue and bicker. And I think as Americans, it's okay to disagree with each other. That's what the First Amendment is all about. We're not robots, but you can disagree without being disagreeable. And I think as long as we all continue to put the country first, I think that's the most important thing we could do under our Constitution and under those rights given to us.
A couple of questions that came in while the two of you were speaking. I'd just like to briefly get your thoughts on these. So the first is, how do military leaders balance encouraging individual freedoms and rights of their personnel while maintaining the needed restrictions of uniformity and morale as an institution?
Dr. Contal, you take that one, or Contal,
Yeah,
you take that
no,
one.
you absolutely should.
Okay. Well, I just, it's just so I'm clear on the question, Paul, I was sitting here writing a note to myself. The question is, if I can frame it, it is, can you just repeat it real quick? Because I know.
Sure. How do military leaders balance encouraging individual freedoms and rights of their personnel while maintaining the needed restrictions of uniformity and morale as an institution?
Yeah, I would just say it's all about the team. So you live, breathe, and eat the team because you have such a sacred duty to the Constitution to support and defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So you want to make sure that you let them be individuals, you let them practice their faith, you let them or not practice any faith or their atheism in some cases, but you want to you want them to have a personal life as much as they possibly can. And sometimes, especially in training or combat operations, those individual liberties that you would normally have to worship, to pray, whatever is or to speak out is restricted, and you can't. So it's really trying to balance when and where you can allow them to express themselves under the Constitution, under the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and under appropriate regulations. But understand that sometimes the facts might dictate that they just simply can't. I will say, no matter whether it's in combat or harsh training exercises, you do have more constitutional rights, though. So things like that Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination will always apply. And as an example, I'm not trying to geek out too much, but if I'm the Dr. Paul McCall, if I think you are guilty of jaywalking because I saw you walk across the street there in Williamstown, New Jersey, the wrong way, and I saw you, and I'm a police officer, I could go up to you and be like, "Hey, did you just walk across the street? Did you just jaywalk? Did you just commit it?" I know it's only a minor offense, but again, if you said, "Yeah, that was me," and then I give you citation, you take me to court and say, "It wasn't me," I could use your words against you. Why? Because you weren't in custody. You have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, but you weren't in custody, so the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply. That same fact scenario, if you are a soldier, you are back to being Lieutenant Colonel Paul McCullough. I'm an MP officer. I see you jaywalk across the street. I go to you and say, "Hey, Colonel, was that you just jaywalk across the street?" You say, "Yes, yeah, it was. Hey, I was in a rush, whatever." Again, I give you citation. Hey, we take you to court. You deny, plead not guilty, you go to court. I cannot use your words against you. Why? Yes, you weren't in custody, but in the military, your Fifth Amendment right applies when you are just a suspect, even if you're not in custody. So again, I'm sorry for geeking out about the Bill of Rights and the Fifth Amendment, which is part of it. But as an example, you're always trying to balance unit cohesion, the military, the mission, but also the individual rights that your men and women have under our great Constitution and the UCMJ.
Honorable Murphy, that was great. Really appreciate your comments on that. Honorable Connaughton, you have anything else to add on that?
Just very, very briefly, I think the way that the parameter around maintaining the law and regulations generally comes up in command structures is that there's guidance issued, particularly around election cycles, that remind folks, at least when it comes to political activity, what they're permitted to do, the bumper sticker on your car or truck versus what you're not allowed to do, and provide somebody in the command structure to whom service members can ask a question if there was one other thing I was thinking, but I'll hold it for another question if it comes back to me.
Okay, last question, and I believe Honorable Murphy already chimed in on part of it. So, do political candidates whose jurisdiction include an active military base ever campaign on the base or base housing?
You want me to start, Patrick, or would you like to?
Sure. Yeah. Good. No, please, good.
Well, this is actually one of the stories that came to my mind as I was reflecting back over situations that I've encountered. Perhaps, people are most attuned to it when a sitting president is visiting a military base as commander in chief. But it certainly has come up in the many years I worked with members of Congress. If they have a base within their jurisdiction, they will hopefully seek guidance in advance on what can and cannot happen on a military base. So when the first year that I was Undersecretary of the Air Force, several personal friends who were members of Congress asked me to come out to their Air Force bases the summer before a November election. And so the restriction in general terms was, while on base, we wouldn't do anything in any way political. If they asked me to meet with in the evening outside of the my official time on base, then I would I had to be careful how I phrased my support for the good works done by that particular member of Congress in the past, but not come out and say, and you should all go vote for Congressman so and so. So for on a military base, always, but particularly in an election year. And Congressman Murphy, you've perhaps experienced this personally. I don't know what you'd like to say.
Yeah, you can't do political speeches on post. They won't let that happen. We do have elected officials who do use military installations to give speeches, but they're not political speeches. It's between your official capacity versus campaigning. And it's interesting. I'm trying to, so I keep putting my glasses on. I think I'm trying to help you out here, Paul. So return to the contempt ratio, actually, the military going woke. I think, I would just say, when you look at the military, and I know you talk about, Sam Huntington's soldiers in the state. I would say to you, our military does reflect our society's values. Our military is a reflection of society, and that's why it's so incredibly important that our military has to look like the American society that it represents. We are in an historic time. We are now 50 years, 5 decades of an all-volunteer force. The all-volunteer force was put forth by President Nixon after Vietnam. Why? Because there was a general viewpoint that the military was for poor people, and it was the people who couldn't get college deferments. It was people who didn't know a congressman or senator to get a deferment, etc. And we established this all volunteer force, which I'm a big believer in. I want the person, the man or woman on my left or right in combat, to want to be there, that wasn't forced to be there. So I do think our military does reflect American values. Some of those values you might disagree with. There's folks who are atheists. I don't agree with them, but I will fight for them because they have a right not to believe in a certain God. I'm a devout Catholic. I pray every day. I raise my family, my children. I go to church every Sunday, or try to, and I say those things. And I go to church and do those things not because I'm a better person than anyone else. I do it because I'm a sinner. I'm not a saint, and I try to get better every single day. So, they're the values that I believe in, and I think that we have to recognize the fact that our military has to look like our society. I'm not just talking about the color of your skin. I am talking about the content of your character. It is good that our military comes from all walks of life, from all 50 states, from people who are Republican, Democrat, Independent, never vote in an election, because it's not about politics. It's about the American people and putting our country first and supporting and defending that Constitution, which is so incredibly important.
Awesome. Honorable Kennedy, any closing remarks? Because we're getting close to 7 o'clock and I want to honor your time.
No, I appreciate that, and I really appreciate the question. And I agree with everything that Secretary Murphy just said. The only other thing I would say is, with the debates that are, Congress is given the responsibility to enact laws, obviously with the president's signature or the override of a presidential veto, but that in the context I'm talking about does not happen very often. So whether we like it or not, the people who are elected from the American governs what happens in the US military the same way that they are passing law that governs every other part of American life. And that's an inherent, part of our Constitution and part of our system. So, in this most recent set of policies that have been enacted in the House, will the ban on transgender surgeries survive? Will the ban on full reproductive rights for women serving in the military to go to a state that provides abortion services survive? I don't know, but it is meant to be in that way also a reflection of the American people as to where they think the country is and how it should apply to the military. And where things change over time, I've seen things reversed. So, again, everybody has strong feelings on these issues, and I don't know where they're going to come out this year, but the idea is that over time, the trend of history is toward justice and toward where the American people believe the right policy is at any given moment. And we have an imperfect system, but thank God we get to live under it. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
Paul and Justin and the whole team, Stephanie, everybody, thanks so much for having us here tonight. Both Aaron Content, Secretary Content, and I are on LinkedIn and social media, and if we can be helpful to your efforts, please let us know.
Yeah,
Dr.
please
Paul
do.
McCullough, thanks so much, for having us. We appreciate it, and God bless all of you and what you do. It's really important work, and we're proud to be part of it tonight's coffee talk.
Thank you. And I just want to say a very special thank you to Honorable Murphy, Honorable Connaughton. Your experience, your insight have been tremendously helpful to this group. I want to thank all the attendees that came and joined us here this evening. And we will send you a follow-up email. If you enjoyed tonight's event, I'd encourage you to consider membership with our organization. And then in about 2 months from now, on the 23rd of September, we're going to be doing our national symposium, our annual national symposium. So the theme for this year's event is faith, freedom, and responsibility, focusing on issues surrounding religious freedom. So you will get an email about both those things, and I would just encourage you to participate and help join us in what we're doing. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you, Honorable Murphy. Thank you, Honorable Connaughton. Really appreciate everybody's time tonight.
Thank you, Paul, and your team.
Thank you.